Good evening, everyone. So unfortunately we couldn't make it to class today due to the weather conditions, but I'm going to make you a short video to basically go through the rest of the chapter for chapter 13, and then hopefully some of chapter 14 I'll put in a different video, and that way we can be caught up for class next week. So make sure to watch these videos before the next class, and if you have any questions, let me know. I'll probably do a Moodle chat later on the week too, just in case anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. But for now, we'll continue on with chapter 13. So when we left off last class, we were talking about language development. We went through the different stages of language development, so today we're going to move on to thinking, so the second part of cognitive development. So a very important name in terms of cognitive development is Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist who proposed that children's cognitive abilities unfold naturally over time. Many of his specific conclusions have been modified or rejected, so we'll talk about his different stages, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the criticisms, the more recent research, but his work did inspire thousands of studies by researchers worldwide. Piaget thought that in order to adapt to new information or new experiences, a child could do one of two things. So they could either assimilate the information into their existing mental categories or accommodate the new experiences by changing their mental categories. So for example, if you're looking at, a Labrador Retriever versus a Terrier, they're both going to fit into the category of dog. So if you already know that Terrier is in the dog category and you see a Labrador Retriever, you're able to assimilate them into that previously existing category of dog. Whereas accommodation occurs when, for example, you have that concept for dog but not one for cat, and then you come across a cat. So you can't put it into one of your existing mental categories, so you must accommodate by creating a new mental category for it. So the mental category of cat. So Piaget thought that both processes are constantly interacting as children go through 4 stages of cognitive development. So he has this 4 stages of cognitive development for children. So the first is the sensory motor stage, which basically occurs between birth and reaching 2 years of age. So the infant learns through concrete actions, and at this point their thinking consists of coordinating sensory information with bodily movements. So they learn that specific movements produce specific results. They gain object permanence, which is basically the idea that something continues to exist even when you cannot see or touch it. So around 6 to 8 months, they're going to gain that concept of object permanence. So for example, if you were to show a 4-month-old baby a ball and then you put a blanket over it, they're going to think that ball kind of ceases to exist. They're not going to look for it. Whereas once they gain that sense of object permanence, if you cover something up, they're still going to realize it exists and they will look for it. So the object permanence represents the beginning of the capacity to use mental imagery and symbols, so that something exists even when you can't physically see it. Next, we move on to the pre-operational stage, which is between 2 to 7 years. Children at this point still lack cognitive abilities necessary to understand abstract principles and some mental operations. He said that they're unable to take another person's point of view because their thinking is egocentric, so it's based on them. They're unable to kind of think about how other people are feeling or what other people might be thinking. And he said at this point they can't grasp the concept of conservation. So that kind of concept that physical properties do not change when form or appearance does. So for example, if they were to take 2 glasses of juice and one was kind of short and fat and the other one was tall and skinny, they would say that there's more juice in the tall one because they're looking for that kind of measure of height instead of really understanding that the volume could be the same, it's just in a different shaped glass. So they still don't have that concept of conservation at this point. And so that's kind of what's going on here in this picture. So you see the child on the left has the 2 balls of clay, and it's the same amount of clay, but one is flattened and the other is a spear. And then the child on the right has the 2 glasses of orange juice. So even though the clay and the orange juice is the same in both situations, they are looking for other cues to tell them which has more. So they're not really able to grasp that concept of conservation, that even though the appearance changes, the volume can remain the same. So next they move into the concrete operation stage, which goes from age 7 to 12. At this point, they're increasingly able to take the perspective of others. They make fewer logical errors. Mental abilities are tied to information that is concrete, so things that have actually happened to them or concepts that have a tangible meaning to them. They still tend to make errors when asked to think about abstract ideas, but at this stage they can understand conservation, reversibility, and cause and effect. So for example, in your pre-operational stage, if you're asking a child to kind of look at, 2 times 6 is 12, and then realize that you can reverse that and have 12 divided by 6 is 2, that's that concept of reversibility we're talking about there. So they're unable to do that until the concrete operation stage. And then finally, you get the formal operation stage, which is basically from 12 to 13 up to adulthood. At this point, children or young adults at this point are capable of abstract reasoning. They can reason about situations that they haven't actually experienced firsthand, and they can search systematically for answers to problems and draw logical conclusions. So, as I mentioned right at the beginning, while Piaget's central ideas have been well supported, just kind of the fact that new reasoning abilities do depend on the emergence of previous ones, further research into the minds of even the youngest infants have led to modification and at times some rejection of his ideas. So we have seen that despite kind of his core concepts being pretty solid, we do have some issues with the way that they were presented, so we'll talk about those. So in terms of the more current views of cognitive development, cognitive abilities develop in continuous overlapping waves rather than discrete steps or stages, so it's not just going from one to the other to the other. Learning does occur gradually, and sometimes we see people retreating or children retreating to former ways of thinking, but they may also advance to new ones. So reasoning ability depends on circumstances, who is asking them the questions, and so kind of over time cognitive development is more continuous than in that kind of discrete stage type of development that Piaget was describing. The second kind of piece in the more current views of cognitive development is that preschoolers are not as egocentric as Piaget thought. So we have seen that most 3- and 4-year-olds can take someone else's perspective. They know that you cannot predict what the person will do just by observing the situation and knowing the facts. So at this point, they start to develop a theory of mind, which we talked about in chapter 9, I believe it was, when talking about animals and their cognition, which is basically a system of beliefs about how their own mind and other people's minds work, and how people are affected by beliefs and emotions. So they use verbs like think and know, and we actually see aspects of a theory of mind present in infancy. So we see that, we talked about previously that you can use the measure of how long a child looks at something to kind of measure their interest, and we actually see that children seem to be surprised, infants seem to be surprised when they learn an adult has a false belief. So even in infancy, they do exhibit some traits of this theory of mind. But we've definitely seen it in 3- and 4-year-old children. For example, they've done studies in which a child puts a ball in a particular place, say in a closet, and then they leave the room. And then an adult comes in and takes the ball from the closet and puts it in a basket. And so then if you ask children who are observing all this take place, if you ask 3-year-olds where the child will look for the ball, they will say in the basket because they know it's in the basket. But if you ask 4-year-olds, 4-year-olds will say that they will look in the closet. So they're basically indicating that despite the fact that they know it's in the basket, they know that the child is going to think that it's still in the closet. So indicating that theory of mind and that they're thinking about somebody else's thinking processes, cognitive processes. Our third point in the current views of cognitive development are that children, even infants, reveal cognitive abilities much earlier than Piaget believed. So we see that babies may be born with mental modules or core knowledge systems for spatial relations, properties of objects, and other features of the physical world. At only 4 months of age, babies look longer at impossible feats, so things that do not obey the laws of physics, such as kind of a ball jumping from one place to the other. And 5-month-olds can perceive others' actions as being intentional. So they're definitely showing much earlier instances of cognitive abilities than Piaget would have predicted with his theory. It kind of goes against that egocentric notion that he had about children at a young age being very egocentric. And then the fourth point we have in current views of cognitive development is cognitive development is influenced by a child's culture. So we had a researcher named Lev Vygotsky, and he said that social cultural influences emphasized in children's cognitive development. Children develop mental representations of the world through culture, language, and the environment, in which, of course, adults play a major role. And instead of stages, a child's cognitive development may proceed in any number of directions. So he was definitely correct in that culture does shape and structure children's cognitive development. So we definitely see a large influence of culture in terms of cognitive development as well, which is something that Piaget kind of ignored in his theory. So despite these modifications, Piaget of course left an enduring legacy. We now know that children are not just passive vessels into which education and experience are poured. They actually go out and actively interpret their worlds around them. So despite the fact that we have seen some of his things proven wrong, he definitely had a very large influence in terms of mapping child cognitive development. So next we'll talk a little bit about moral development. This isn't a really big section in the chapter, but just something that we kind of want to mention briefly. So we had a researcher named Lawrence Kohlberg, and he said that children's abilities to understand right from wrong evolves along with the rest of their cognitive abilities through 3 different stages. So the first stage, they would obey because they fear being punished, and then later because they think it's in their best interest, they stand to gain something from it. The second stage would be around age 10. They begin to kind of grasp moral judgment as based on conformity and loyalty to others, and then later within this stage based on an understanding of the rule of the law, so actually following the laws that are set out for us. And then the third stage, in adulthood, some people, but not all, will develop a moral standard based on universal human rights. So you know what's best for everyone, what's right for humanity as a whole. So while Kohlberg has definitely been shown to be right that moral reasoning ability increases during the school years, we also see behaviors like cheating, lying, and cruelty, as well as the ability to rationalize these behaviors. So he was maybe on the right track with some of his ideas, but I don't think it's that simple in terms of moral development. Today's developmental psychologists place a greater emphasis on the emergence of conscious and moral emotions such as shame, guilt, and empathy. Children do not obey rules only because they fear the consequences of disobeying. They do so because they also understand right from wrong. Capacity for differentiating right from wrong may be inborn, may have originated in cooperative altruistic strategies that help resolve conflicts. So we see evidence in even young children, even by the age of 5, they know that it's wrong to hurt someone, even if they're actually being told to by an authority figure. So we definitely see that it develops fairly quickly in childhood. And parental techniques were assumed to have an effect, but many behavioral genetic studies provided evidence that the effectiveness of parental techniques depend on what kind of child they have. So dandelions, ones that have a very easygoing temperament and are going to kind of flourish no matter the environment, versus orchid children who are a lot more susceptible to environmental influences. So they have to be raised and cared for in a very specific way. So today, many researchers seek a middle ground. As with pretty much everything in psychology, we talk more about the gene versus environmental interactions. So it's not just because of the environment, so the consequences, things like that, and it's not just because of the genetic components, such as kind of things being inborn or being affected by genetically determined temperament. So we're kind of looking at the intersection of both, as with most of the things we talk about in psychology. So in terms of getting children to be good, to behave in positive ways, many parents will try to enforce moral standards by using power assertion, which is generally taking advantage of being bigger, stronger, and more powerful. And it may include threats, physical punishment, and deprivation of privileges. Other parents rely on induction techniques. So this is basically appealing to the child's sense of empathy and helpful nature, their affection for others, and their sense of responsibility. So they reference their own abilities rather than external reasons to be good. So power assertion, for example, is, do that because I told you so, or do that or you're going to be in trouble. Whereas induction would be, don't you want to be nice to that person because you're a good person, and I think that it would be very mean of you to not play with, this other person or whatever. So basically appealing to their sense of good nature as opposed to using power assertion and saying, well, do it because I said so, or do it because you're going to be punished. So of course the culture and the context in which discipline occurs can make a big difference, but often power assertion, especially when it consists of parental bullying and physical punishment, is associated with greater aggressiveness and reduced empathy, and in many cases induction seems to be the more effective form of discipline. In terms of self-control and conscience, We see that self-regulation is very important. So self-regulation is the ability to suppress immediate impulses and wishes. It's one of the most important social emotional skills that a child needs to acquire. So self-regulation predicts a child's ability to delay gratification. For example, with the marshmallow test. So basically, they took very young children and offered them one marshmallow, and if they were able to leave that one marshmallow alone for a few minutes and resist the temptation to eat it, they could get two instead. So they were left alone with the marshmallow, and the ones that were able to delay gratification in terms of waiting for the two marshmallows as opposed to eating the one right away, it actually showed effects on health, success, and well-being that last for decades. So those children who exhibit an ability to delay gratification are better able to control negative emotions, to pay attention to a current task, and to do well in school. This skill did seem to be partially influenced by temperament and personality, but also by learning. So we've seen longitudinal studies of 106 preschool children show that those most able to regulate their impulses early in life were the least likely to get in trouble later and the most likely to have a high conscience score. And self-regulation was negatively correlated with mother's use of power assertion. So she didn't have to use power assertion as much if the child was able to self-regulate. However, it may work both ways. It may not be so much that the mothers don't have to use power assertion with the self-regulation, with the children who are good in self-regulation. It could be that the impulsive and aggressive children kind of need power assertion in order to behave. So it may kind of work in both ways. It's not just as simple as saying that if a mother doesn't use power assertion, then her child is going to be good at self-regulation. So now we move on to gender development. So a baby's sex seems to be the first thing that everyone notices and announces, but we want to look at how soon children themselves notice that there are different sexes and understand which one they are. So we have several important terms in this section. The first would be gender identity, which is a child's sense of being male or female and belonging to a certain sex. The next is gender typing, which is the process of socializing children into their gender roles. And this basically reflects a society's ideas about which traits and behaviors and interests are deemed masculine or feminine. So we see that a person can have a strong gender identity but not be gender typed. So just because somebody strongly identifies as masculine does not mean that they're only going to want to, play masculine games and be in a masculine job. If they're comfortable enough in their masculinity, then they might do things that are considered more feminine and be totally okay with it. So you can have a very strong gender identity but not conform to the gender typing. In the past, researchers tried to distinguish between sex in terms of the anatomical attributes, so the genetic attributes, and gender, which would be kind of described as the learned differences. But today these terms are often used interchangeably because, as we know, nature and nurture are inextricably linked. However, some people do not fit the typical categories of male and female. So at times we have intersex conditions, which were formerly known as hermaphroditism. And so this is when chromosomal or hormonal abnormalities cause a child to be born with ambiguous genitals or genitals that conflict with chromosomes. So either genitals that you can't really tell whether they're supposed to be male or female, or ones that conflict with their chromosomal makeup. Many intersex individuals will grow up and label themselves as transgender, which is basically a broad term describing people who do not fit comfortably into the usual categories of male and female. Some are comfortable living with attributes of both sexes, while others feel uncomfortable in their sex of rearing and wish to be considered a member of the opposite sex. And then we have another term, which is transsexual. And again, depending on who you're talking to and where you're kind of encountering this information, these terms may be a little more fluid. They change from source to source. But your textbook defines transsexual as someone who isn't intersexed, but feel that they are in the wrong body. And so many of these people will eventually transition to the gender that they believe themselves to be. In terms of influences on gender development, we have three major categories. We know that there are many interacting influences that act upon the development of gender identity and gender typing, but they typically fit into either biological influences, cognitive influences, or learning influences. And so we're going to go through and talk a little bit about each one of these types. In terms of biological influences, we see children all over the world usually choosing to play with friends of the same sex, and the type of play does differ by sex. Males typically tend to be more likely to go for physical roughhousing, risk-taking, and aggressive play. And we also see certain toys being preferred by each. Biological psychologists believe that these play and toy preferences have a basis in prenatal hormones, particularly in the presence or absence of prenatal androgens, which are those masculinizing hormones that we've talked about in the past. So girls who are exposed to higher than average levels of prenatal hormones or prenatal androgens later are more likely to enjoy boy toys and are more physically aggressive. In a study of more than 200 children, we found relationships between fetal testosterone and play styles. So the ones that had higher testosterone levels, they tended to engage in more male-typical play. And we've actually even seen this type of preference in monkeys. So for example, in male rhesus monkeys, they seem to prefer more wheeled toys rather than cuddly, and whereas the female rhesus monkeys were more varied. So then we ask the question, do these findings have anything to do with gender identity? However, despite the fact that this does give us kind of some evidence, the answer is very complex. So gender identity depends not only on the interaction of genes, prenatal hormones, and anatomical structures, but also life experiences. So they've done many studies, one of which 16 genetic males were born without penises, and so some of them were assigned at birth to live as females, I think 14, and then the other 2 were left to live as males. And so when they look at that 14, you have, I think, 4 or 5 of them who are still living as females. You have several who have kind of transitioned or decided that they want to be referred to as male, and there's one of them, I think, who is kind of living as not identifying as either gender. So we do see, despite the fact they all had the same biological situation at the beginning, there were varying kind of ways in which they grew and learned to adapt to their circumstances. So obviously experience does play a role as well. So next we'll move on to cognitive influences. So cognitive psychologists explain children's gender segregation and toy and play preferences by studying their change in cognitive abilities. So even before children can speak, they can discriminate between the 2 sexes. Pretty much at about 9 months are able to distinguish between, that there are 2 sexes and distinguish between them. By 18 to 20 months, toddlers have a concept of gender labels. They're able to identify their own gender and that of others. And then shortly before age 2, they change their behavior to conform to the category that they belong to. So they kind of become more gender typed. So at this point, you know, you're seeing girls stopping behaving as aggressively. By around age 5, most children develop a stable gender identity and understand that what boys and girls do does not necessarily indicate their sex. So when they're kind of very young, between, you know, maybe ages 2 and 5, they're very, you know, guys should do this, girls should do this. But by around 5, they're able to kind of understand that, you know, a girl is still a girl if she climbs a tree, or a boy is still a boy if he plays with dolls. So they then consolidate all of their knowledge about gender and gender typing into a gender schema, which is basically a mental network of beliefs and expectations about what it means to be male or female, and what each sex is supposed to think, feel, wear, and do. But the content is not innate. Cultures and religions differ definitely in their gender schemas. The schemas can be very powerful, but they can also vary from place to place. And gender schemas we see tend to be most rigid between the ages of 5 and 7, and some people retain these very inflexible schemas their entire lives, but many do become flexible with experience and cognitive sophistication. So a lot of people, as they age, they realize that not everything has to fit in those rigid boxes of male or female. Then we move on to learning influences. So the environment is full of subtle and not so subtle messages about what girls and boys are supposed to do. Gender socialization, which begins at birth, instills these messages in children. Something as trivial as dressing a baby in a particular color can signal adults about how to treat the child. So even, I mean, a baby obviously doesn't realize whether you're dressing them in blue or pink or purple or green, but this does kind of signal to adults about the gender and the sex of the baby, and how, and they do tend to treat the child in different ways depending. And parents and teachers and other adults can convey their expectations about gender without even realizing that they are doing so. So, for example, if you're looking at maybe a trait that's considered to be more predominantly male, such as being very, very good at math. If a male scores high on a math test and you tell him you're a natural versus a female scores well on a math test and you tell her you must have worked hard, that's kind of indicating to the children whether or not you think that ability comes natural to them. And unfortunately, we see as children age, both sexes tend to lose interest in activities that are supposedly not natural for them, even when they start out with equal abilities. So overall, based on the 3 types of influences and the various things we've talked about, we see that gender development is a lifelong process. It involves schemas, attitudes, and behaviors which evolve over time. So there's not really one right or wrong answer in terms of gender development. There's lots of different influences there. So next we'll move on to adolescence. There's not a ton in this section, basically just talking about kind of some of the hallmarks. So we have a period known as adrenarche, which is between the ages 6 and 12. And so this is when the adrenal glands start to pump out hormones that affect brain development, most notably DHEA, which is an androgen or masculizing hormone, which divert glucose to the brain to foster the maturation of brain areas vital to interpreting social and emotional cues. So the brains at this point, between the ages of 6 and 12, are the most flexible and responsive to learning. This period of middle childhood is very important on the road to adulthood. Children tend to be given more responsibilities in many cultures, which vary in seriousness. So depending on what culture you live in, before the age of 12, some children may be working pretty much, full time, whereas in our society, for example, at this point, children are basically just expected to go to school and continue learning, about the various subjects that we teach in our elementary schools. So after adrenarche, so a little while after 12, basically whenever puberty hits, we see the period known as adolescence. So following this middle childhood, the period of development between puberty, which is when the person becomes capable of sexual reproduction, and adulthood is known as adolescence. So in some cultures, the time span between puberty and adulthood is only a few months. Some cultures basically say as soon as you are able to sexually reproduce, you should get married and, start a family, whereas in modern Western societies, we do not consider teenagers to be adults. So we don't consider them emotionally mature enough to take on those responsibilities of adulthood. It really depends on what culture you're a part of. In terms of the physiology of adolescence, until puberty, boys and girls both produce roughly the same levels of androgens and estrogens, but at puberty, the brain's pituitary gland stimulates hormone production in the gonads and the adrenal glands, and from then on, males produce more androgens and females produce more estrogens. So in boys, the gonads are known as the testicles, which produce sperm. In females, the gonads are the ovaries, which release eggs, and at puberty, these organs mature, and the individual becomes capable of sexual reproduction. Girls experience the development of breasts and menarche, which is the onset of menstruation, while boys experience the onset of nocturnal emissions and growth of the testes, scrotum, and penis, and both experience the emergence of secondary sex characteristics as well. So not those kind of hallmark signs of puberty, but the more secondary characteristics such as deepened voice and facial hair in boys and pubic hair in both sexes. The onset of puberty depends on both biological and environmental factors. So for example, menarche, or the onset of menstruation, depends on critical levels of body fat, which may help to explain the average age of puberty having declined in North America and Europe recently. So if you remember in chapter 12, we talked about the incidence of overweight and obese individuals is increasingly on the rise in North America. And if menarche depends on critical levels of body fat, this could explain why some girls are getting their periods earlier than in the past. In North America, the average age of menarche is 12.5. In parts of Africa, it is 14 to 17 years old. So we do see definitely a much lower average age of puberty in North America. Individuals vary dramatically in the onset and length of puberty. Some girls experience menarche at ages 9 or 10, whereas some boys are still growing at age 19. So it really depends, even within a culture. And earlier puberty can be associated with both negative and positive effects in both sexes. So it may be associated with being more popular, but it can also be associated with higher likeliness of smoking, drinking, and fighting with parents, so engaging in some of those more risky behaviors. And the changes surrounding puberty may serve to accentuate existing behavioral problems and family conflicts. So a very important question we asked in terms of adolescence is, when does a teenager become capable of thinking like an adult? And this is very important in terms of a criminal justice standpoint, because a lot of the time we have teenagers committing some very atrocious crimes, and we have to determine whether or not we can treat them like an adult in terms of putting them on trial. So it can definitely be a matter of life and death. In many American states, teenagers are tried and sentenced as adults, but evidence shows that adolescents often get into trouble because their brains are neurologically immature. So some researchers argue that many teenagers who commit crimes should be considered less guilty by reasons of adolescence. And the Youth Criminal Justice Act here in Canada states that youth who are 14 years or older can be transferred to adult court for trial for major offenses. Since its introduction in 2001, we've seen far less incarceration of young offenders in Canada. So we definitely see that adolescents are a bit more vulnerable in terms of their brain development. They undergo pruning of synapses and myelinization, which makes them more vulnerable in terms of their thinking. So the synapses are involved in impulse control and planning and emotional processing, and they're more vulnerable to things such as peer pressure, and they may lack the reasoning abilities to foresee consequences. So it's the question still kind of remains. It's a very important issue in terms of whether or not they should be considered adults in a court of law, but this is just kind of some of the information that we should consider when making those types of decisions. In terms of the psychology of adolescence, overall, feelings of self-esteem do not suddenly plummet during adolescence, despite what many people think, and today's teenagers may actually be more conservative sexually than their parent generation. We actually see the age of first sexual experience increasing in recent years. Only the rate of teen pregnancy has increased due to lower contraceptive use. And studies of adolescents find only a small minority are seriously troubled, angry, or unhappy. Most seem to have supportive families and skills to cope with their problems. So despite the kind of stereotype as a teenager of this angsty, aggressive, brooding person, we actually do see that very few of them are seriously troubled or unhappy. However, we do see three kinds of problems being more common in adolescence. These will be conflict with parents, mood swings and depression, and higher rates of risky behavior and rule breaking, which could of course be associated with that brain development we just talked about in the last slide. Adolescents who are troubled tend to express these concerns in ways characteristic of their sex. So boys are far more likely to externalize their feelings and lash out, whereas girls are more likely to internalize and deal with their issues in different ways without kind of really talking about them, trying to control other aspects of their life. So we see, for example, aggression and antisocial behavior in boys, whereas in females sometimes they can become withdrawn, they tend to blame themselves, and may develop eating disorders. However, we see no gender differences in overall self-esteem, but in some specific areas of self-esteem, we do see differences. Girls, for example, tend to have more issues with their appearance or their bodies, whereas boys have more issues with their social behavior. The psychology of adolescence is profoundly dependent on culture. We see past periods of social upheaval and rebellion versus today. Most teenagers tend to remain close to their parents. Culture has also had an influence on the trait narcissism, which is a combination of excessive self-regard and lack of empathy. And there seems to be much evidence that this trait has been rising among today's college students and younger teenagers, which may be due to the fact that we live in a time where Western culture has become more self-focused and less other-directed. So even your textbook talks about looking at recent song titles in the last few years, and there's a lot, like I am me, and it's gonna be me, and there's a lot that are focused on the self as opposed to others. And then finally we reach adulthood. So there's not a ton in this section. Basically, over the years, many philosophers, writers, and scientists have speculated on the course of adult development, whether its changes are predictable, as with childhood, what the major psychological issues are, and if mental and physical deterioration in old age is inevitable. So this section will review several topics related to adult development, as outlined below. So we'll talk about stages and ages, so it's more of a lifespan approach to aging. We'll talk about the transition periods of life, those key transitions, and then we'll talk a little bit about old age. So in terms of stages and ages, we have Erik Erikson, who basically proposed a lifespan approach to psychological development. and he thought that all individuals go through 8 stages, each of which are characterized by a crisis or a psychological challenge that must be resolved before moving forward. So he was one of the first to kind of basically, whereas Piaget was kind of like the development kind of tapered off after childhood, Erikson went right on through to adulthood and old age. So the first stage that Erikson talks about was trust versus mistrust, and this occurs within the first year of life. The baby must depend on adults to provide it with necessities, so in order to kind of resolve that crisis, they must be well taken care of at this point, or else they may learn to mistrust others. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So from ages 1 to 2, they must learn to be independent without having too much self-doubt. The third is initiative versus guilt. So from the ages 3 to 5, they learn to use new skills, but also to control impulses. So the key crisis to kind of resolve here is learning to not feel too guilty about using your new skills and being able to adequately control impulsive behavior. The fourth stage is confidence versus inferiority, and this occurs between the ages 6 to 12, where they must learn valuable life skills without failing the lessons of mastery. Then next we have identity versus role confusion, which occurs during ages 13 to 19, and basically this is a very important period in which teenagers must decide who they are and who they are going to be, and they must resolve an identity crisis over, you know, who they're going to be and how they're going to turn out. And then sixth stage is intimacy versus isolation. So from ages 20 to 40, at this point you've already established who you want to be, but now you must learn to share yourself with another. So to kind of take on a life partner or someone to help share your life with. Then we have generativity versus stagnation, which is between the ages 50 to 65. And so you're going to want to experience generativity, which is creativity and renewal, instead of sinking into complacency and selfishness. Parenthood can definitely help in terms of generativity. And then finally, we have ego integrity versus despair, which is basically from ages 65 and up. I guess at this point we'd call them seniors, must strive to reach ultimate goals of wisdom, spiritual tranquility, and acceptance of their lives. So kind of aging with dignity as opposed to just kind of dropping into depression and despair. So Erikson, of course, recognized that cultural and economic factors affected this progression. And now that many people's lives have become less traditional and predictable, these issues may occur in different orders or be revisited. So there's, of course, not one process of aging, but many. Therefore, stage theories do not adequately describe how adults grow and change across the lifespan, but Erikson was right to show that development does not stop at adolescence or young adulthood. So his ideas were influential because they placed adult development in the context of family, work, and society, and specified many of the essential concerns of adulthood. So despite the fact that he wasn't 100% right on with his theory, it did kind of show us some key points that helped pave the way for further research and specify some of the essential concerns in terms of adulthood. So then we move on to the transition periods of life. So when nearly everyone your age is going through a transition, it is easy to adjust to if you are going through it yourself, or it's easy to adjust when you are not transitioning but no one else is either. However, unfortunately, sometimes you see everyone around you doing something and you're unable to participate. And so when we kind of come across these unanticipated transitions, so for example, getting fired, or changes that we expect to happen but don't, such as getting married at a certain age or getting a job right out of college, we can have some issues. So we talk about emerging adulthood, which is the period between the ages of 18 to 25. People may report in some ways feeling that they have reached adulthood, but in other ways they do not. In industrialized nations, major demographic changes have postponed the timing of career decisions, marriage or cohabitation, and parenthood until late 20s or early 30s. So we see a lot of different demographic and cultural societal changes that have kind of thrown a lot of people off what they would consider kind of the track that they were on. So people in this age group between 18 and 25 may still be transitioning from being dependent on their parents, often while finishing up post-secondary education and becoming fully self-sufficient. So they would describe themselves most likely as mature in some ways, but not in others. So emerging adults tend to be more emotionally controlled than teenagers, more confident, less dependent, and less angry and alienated, but they are also more likely to live unstable lives and feel unrooted. They may move more often and have higher rates of risky behavior than any other age group. So the overall shift in industrialized nations means that emerging adulthood is likely to grow in importance as a distinct phase. So as we see a lot of these societal and cultural kind of things shifting, we are going to be looking more at emerging adulthood as its own phase and trying to examine some of the kind of crises that need to be resolved within this stage. So then we have the middle years, which is ages 35 to 65. Many people consider this to be the prime of life. It's typically a time of greatest psychological well-being, good health, and productivity and community involvement, but it's also a time of reflection and reassessment. So at this point, the crises that need to be resolved are usually not due to age, they're more to specific life-changing events. And during this period, menopause, or the cessation of menstruation, occurs in women. And there's a lot of negative stereotypes surrounding menopause, but many women actually view menopause with relief. Very few report major negative symptoms, so we actually get less than 5% reporting severe emotional symptoms of menopause. And we have fewer than half reporting physical symptoms as well. It's important to note that men have a biological clock too, despite the fact that theoretically they don't really have a period where they all of a sudden stop producing sperm. As they do get older, their sperm count does dwindle and they may be more at risk for issues if they are to get someone pregnant at that point, more prenatal issues. So the physical changes do not themselves predict how we feel about aging, it's more so influenced by the culture that you're a part of. And then finally we reach old age. So in Canada, life expectancies for men are around 79 years and women are around 83. So we've separated the elderly into 3 different categories. We have the young old, which are 60 to 75 years of age, the old, which are 75 to 85 years of age, and the oldest old, which are 85 years of age plus. So we've seen the fastest growing segment of the population in Canada is the oldest old. In 1952, we had 175 people over the age of 100. By 2011, there were 5,825. So obviously a very steadily increasing segment of the population. And we have gerontologists who are researchers who study aging in the old. They've been investigating the potential consequences of such a major demographic change. One consequence that we've seen involves the phase of retirement changing significantly. So retirements, instead of basically being kind of, okay, you give up working and you're, within a few years, that's pretty much your life is up. Retirements may now last 20 to 30 years. It's no longer a simple transition. And so there's been a lot of movement towards a phase of positive retirement in which individuals find new jobs, volunteer work, or other new activities with which to occupy their time. However, we do see various aspects of intelligence, memory, and decision-making that decline significantly with age. So we have 2 different types of intelligence that we talk about, and I kind of mentioned these, I think, back in chapter 9. You have fluid intelligence, which is the capacity for deductive reasoning and the ability to use new information to solve problems. It partially reflects an inherited predisposition, and it parallels other biological capacities in that it grows earlier in life and later declines. So we do see a decline in fluid intelligence in terms of older age, whereas we have crystallized intelligence, which is the knowledge and skills built up over a lifetime that depend heavily on education experience, and this type of intelligence tends to remain stable or even improve over the lifespan. So in fact, we actually see that many of the physical and mental losses that do occur in old age are physiologically and genetically based and are seen in all societies. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those, some of those losses now and how we can help prevent them. Oh, my goodness. So there are a lot of declines that involve cultural, behavioral, and psychological factors. Apparent senility is also caused by malnutrition, prescription medications, harmful medication combinations, and even over-the-counter drugs. Weakness, frailty, and even some diseases may be caused by inactivity. Depression, Passivity and memory problems may result from loss of meaningful activity, intellectual stimulation, goals to pursue, and control over events. So older people can profit from aerobic exercise and strength training, as well as mental stimulation. And it has been shown that as people get older, they are better able to regulate negative emotions and emphasize the positive. So people who exercise regularly, remain mentally active, and adapt flexibly can have a long and fruitful old age. So there are several things that you can do in order to help protect yourself against some of the declines that we often see with age. So basically the challenge for society right now is to prepare for the many people who will be living to an advanced age by helping as many as possible to keep using their brains instead of losing them. And the last little thing they talk about in this chapter is the wellsprings of resilience. So children who have been neglected or abused are more likely to have emotional problems, become delinquent, have low IQs, drop out of school, and develop mental disorders or chronic stress-related illnesses. However, early trauma does not always have long-lasting negative effects. Most children have been seen to be very resilient, eventually overcoming the effects of extreme adverse situations, and even adults show this ability frequently. Resilience is actually quite ordinary. People think the people that bounce back from trauma, that's got to be like a very kind of special kind of person, but in reality, the majority of people do tend to show resilience when faced with negative situations. And there are 4 characteristics that have been linked to this trait. Easygoing temperament or personality traits, so feeling that you have a high sense of self-efficacy or self-control. Secure attachment styles, not just to parents, but to other important people around you. Positive experiences outside of the family, so in schools or other organizations, and how one interprets their experiences, so how they kind of cognitively interpret the things that have happened to them, so they can decide to kind of break free of the negative cycles rather than succumbing to them. And for our last little Take Psychology With You section, so with all of the various methods of parenting and sources that tell you what you should and should not do, it's